Embark on a captivating journey beyond the bounds of Earth with C.S. Lewis in Out of the Silent Planet. This extraordinary tale follows Ransom, a philologist who inadvertently finds himself on a spaceship headed to the mysterious planet Malacandra. Discover the breathtaking landscapes and strange creatures of a world unlike any other. Through chapters 10 to 13, witness Ransom's deep immersion into the vibrant cultures of Malacandra. From learning the Rasa language to exploring the philosophical depths of alien societies, Ransom's adventure is not just about exploration, but about understanding and respecting the intricate web of life that spans across the universe. Join us as we delve into the profound themes of harmony with nature, societal integration, and the transformative journey of an ordinary man in an extraordinary world. This is more than just a story. It's a reflection on humanity's place in the cosmos and the universal values that connect us all. Don't miss this deep dive into one of Lewis's most thought-provoking works.
Chapter 10. When Ransom had finished his meal and drunk again of the strong waters of Malacandra, his host rose and entered the boat. He did this head first, like an animal, his sinuous body allowing him to rest his hands on the bottom of the boat while his feet were still planted on the land. He completed the operation by flinging rump, tail, and hind legs all together about 5 feet into the air, and then whisking them neatly on board with an agility which would have been quite impossible to an animal of his bulk on Earth. Having got into the boat, he proceeded to get out again, and then pointed to it. Ransom understood that he was being invited to follow his example. The question which he wanted to ask above all others could not, of course, be put. Were the Hrossa, he discovered later that this was the plural of Hross, the dominant species on Malacandra, and the Sorns, despite their more man-like shape, merely a semi-intelligent kind of cattle? Fervently he hoped that it might be so. On the other hand, the Hrossa might be the domestic animals of the Sorns, in which case the latter would be super-intelligent. His whole imaginative training somehow encouraged him to associate superhuman intelligence with monstrosity of form and ruthlessness of will. To step on board the Hrossa's boat might mean surrendering himself to Sorns at the other end of the journey. On the other hand, the Hrossa's invitation might be a golden opportunity of leaving the Sorn-haunted forests forever. And by this time, the Hross itself was becoming puzzled at his apparent inability to understand it. The urgency of its signs finally determined him. The thought of parting from the Hross could not be seriously entertained. Its animality shocked him in a dozen ways, but his longing to learn its language, and deeper still, the shy, ineluctable fascination of unlike for unlike, the sense that the key to prodigious adventure was being put in his hands, all this had really attached him to it by bonds stronger than he knew. He stepped into the boat. The boat was without seats. It had a very high prow, an enormous expanse of freeboard, and what seemed to Ransom an impossibly shallow draft. Indeed, very little of it even rested on the water. He was reminded of a modern European speedboat. It was moored by something that looked at first like rope, but the Hross cast off not by untying, but by simply pulling the apparent rope in two, as one might pull into a piece of soft toffee or a roll of plasticine. It then squatted down on its rump in the stern sheets and took up a paddle of such enormous blade that Ransom wondered how the creature could wield it, till he again remembered how light a planet they were on. The length of the Hrossa's body enabled him to work freely in the squatting position despite the high gunwale. It paddled quickly. For the first few minutes they passed between banks wooded with the purple trees, upon a waterway not more than 100 yards in width. Then they doubled a promontory, and Ransom saw that they were emerging onto a much larger sheet of water, a great lake, almost a sea. The Hross, now taking great care, and often changing direction and looking about it, paddled well out from the shore. The dazzling blue expanse grew moment by moment wider around them. Ransom could not look steadily at it. The warmth from the water was oppressive. He removed his cap and jerkin, and by so doing surprised the Hross very much. He rose cautiously to a standing position and surveyed the Malacandrian prospect which had opened on every side. Before and behind them lay the glittering lake, here studded with islands, and there smiling uninterruptedly at the pale blue sky. The sun, he noticed, was almost immediately overhead. They were in the Malacandrian tropics. At each end, the lake vanished into more complicated groupings of land and water, softly, featherily embossed in the purple giant weed. But this marshy land, or chain of archipelagos, as he now beheld it, was bordered on each side with jagged walls of the pale green mountains, which he could still hardly call mountains, so tall were they, so gaunt, sharp, narrow, and seemingly unbalanced. On the starboard, they were not more than a mile away, and seemed divided from the water only by a narrow strip of forest. To the left, they were far more distant, though still impressive, perhaps 7 miles from the boat. They ran on each side of the watered country as far as he could see, both onwards and behind them. He was sailing, in fact, on the flooded floor of a majestic canyon nearly 10 miles wide and of unknown length. Behind, and sometimes above the mountain peaks, he could make out in many places great billowy piles of the rose-red substance which he had yesterday mistaken for cloud. The mountains, in fact, seemed to have no fall of ground behind them. They were rather the serrated bastion of immeasurable tablelands, higher in many places than themselves, which made the Malacandrian horizon left and right as far as the eye could reach. Only straight ahead and straight astern was the planet cut with the vast gorge, which now appeared to him only as a rut or crack in the tableland. He wondered what the cloud-like red masses were, and endeavored to ask by signs. The question was, however, too particular for sign language. The horse, with a wealth of gesticulation, its arms or forelimbs were more flexible than his, and in quick motion almost whip-like, made it clear that it supposed him to be asking about the high ground in general. It named this Harandra. The low-watered country, the gorge or canyon, appeared to be Handramit. Ransom grasped the implications. Handra, earth; Harandra, high earth, mountain; Handramit, low earth, valley. Highland and lowland, in fact. The peculiar importance of the distinction in Malacandrian geography he learned later. By this time the cross had attained the end of its careful navigation. They were a couple of miles from land when it suddenly ceased paddling and sat tense with its paddle poised in the air. At the same moment the boat quivered and shot forward as if from a catapult. They had apparently availed themselves of some current. In a few seconds they were racing forward at some 15 miles an hour, and rising and falling on the strange, sharp, perpendicular waves of Malacandra with a jerky motion quite unlike that of the choppiest sea that Ransom had ever met on earth. It reminded him of disastrous experiences on a trotting horse in the army, and it was intensely disagreeable. He gripped the gunwale with his left hand and mopped his brow with his right. The damp warmth from the water had become very troublesome. He wondered if the Malacandrian food, and still more the Malacandrian drink, were really digestible by a human stomach. Thank heaven he was a good sailor. At least, a fairly good sailor. At least. Hastily he leaned over the side. Heat from blue water smote up to his face. In the depth he thought he saw eels playing, long silver eels. The worst happened not once but many times. In his misery he remembered vividly the shame of being sick at a children's party, long ago in the star where he was born. He felt a similar shame now. It was not thus that the first representative of humanity would choose to appear before a new species. Did Rossa vomit too? Would it know what he was doing? Shaking and groaning, he turned back into the boat. The creature was keeping an eye on him, but its face seemed to him expressionless. It was only long after that he learned to read the Malacandrian face. The current, meanwhile, seemed to be gathering speed. In a huge curve, they swung across the lake to within a furlong of the farther shore, then back again, and once more onward, in giddy spirals and figures of 8, while purple wood and jagged mountain raced backwards, and Ransom loathingly associated their sinuous course with the nauseous curling of the silver eels. He was rapidly losing all interest in Malacandra. The distinction between Earth and other planets seemed of no importance compared with the awful distinction of earth and water. He wondered despairingly whether the Ross habitually lived on water. Perhaps they were going to spend the night in this detestable boat. His sufferings did not, in fact, last long. There came a blessed cessation of the choppy movement and a slackening of speed, and he saw that the Ross was backing water rapidly. They were still afloat, with shores close on each side. Between them, a narrow channel in which the water hissed furiously, apparently a shallow. The Ross jumped overboard, splashing abundance of warm water into the ship. Ransom, more cautiously and shakily, clambered after it. He was about up to his knees. To his astonishment, the horse, without any appearance of effort, lifted the boat bodily onto the top of its head, steadied it with one forepaw, and proceeded, erect as a Grecian caryatid, to the land. They walked forward, if the swinging movement of the horse's short legs from its flexible hips could be called walking, beside the channel. In a few minutes, Ransom saw a new landscape. The channel was not only a shallow, but a rapid, the first, indeed, of a series of rapids by which the water descended steeply for the next half-mile. The ground fell away before them, and the canyon, or Handramit, continued at a very much lower level. Its walls, however, did not sink with it, and from his present position, Ransom got a clearer notion of the lie of the land. Far more of the highlands to the left and right were visible, sometimes covered with the cloud-like red swellings, but more often level, pale, and barren to where the smooth line of their horizon marched with the sky. The mountain peaks now appeared only as the fringe or border of the true highland, surrounding it as the lower teeth surround the top. He was struck by the vivid contrast between Harandra and Handramit. Like a rope of jewels, the gorge spread beneath him, purple, sapphire blue, yellow, and pinkish white, a rich and variegated inlay of wooded land and disappearing, reappearing, ubiquitous water. Malacandra was less like earth than he had been beginning to suppose. The Handramit was no true valley rising and falling with the mountain chain it belonged to. Indeed, it did not belong to a mountain chain. It was only an enormous crack or ditch of varying depth running through the high and level Harandra. The latter, he now began to suspect, was the true surface of the planet, certainly would appear as surface to a terrestrial astronomer. To the Handramit itself there seemed no end. Uninterrupted and very nearly straight, it ran before him, a narrowing line of color, to where it clove the horizon with a V-shaped indenture. There must be 100 miles of it in view, he thought, and he reckoned that he had put some 30 or 40 miles of it behind him since yesterday. All this time, they were descending beside the rapids to where the water was level again, and the horse could relaunch its skiff. During this walk, Ransom learned the words for boat, rapid, water, sun, and carry. The latter, as his first verb, interested him particularly. The horse was also at some pains to impress upon him an association or relation which it tried to convey by repeating the contrasting pairs of words Hossa Handramit and Serani Harandra. Ransom understood him to mean that the Hossa lived down in the Handramit and the Serani up on the Harandra. What the deuce was Serani, he wondered. The open reaches of the Harandra did not look as if anything lived up there. Perhaps the Hossa had a mythology. He took it for granted they were on a low cultural level, and the Serani were gods or demons. The journey continued with frequent, though decreasing, recurrences of nausea for Ransom. Hours later he realized that Serani might very well be the plural of Sorn. The sun declined on their right. It dropped quicker than on Earth, or at least on those parts of Earth that Ransom knew, and in the cloudless sky it had little sunset pomp about it. In some other queer way which he could not specify, it differed from the sun he knew. But even while he speculated, the needle-like mountain tops stood out black against it, and the Handramit grew dark, though eastward, to their left, the high country of the Harandra still shone pale rose, remote and smooth and tranquil, like another and more spiritual world. Soon he became aware that they were landing again, that they were treading solid ground, were making for the depth of the purple forest. The motion of the boat still worked in his fantasy, and the earth seemed to sway beneath him. This, with weariness and twilight, made the rest of the journey dreamlike. Light began to glare in his eyes. A fire was burning. It illuminated the huge leaves overhead, and he saw stars beyond them. Dozens of Hossa seemed to have surrounded him, more animal, less human in their multitude and their close neighborhood to him than his solitary guide had seemed. He felt some fear, but more a ghastly inappropriateness. He wanted men, any men, even Western and divine. He was too tired to do anything about all these meaningless bullet heads and fairy faces, could make no response at all. And then, lower down, closer to him, more mobile, came in throngs the whelps, the puppies, the cubs, whatever you called them. Suddenly his mood changed. They were jolly little things. He laid his hand on one black head and smiled. The creature scurried away. He never could remember much of that evening. There was more eating and drinking. There was continual coming and going of black forms. There were strange eyes luminous in the firelight. Finally, there was sleep in some dark, apparently covered place. Chapter 11. Ever since he awoke on the spaceship, Ransom had been thinking about the amazing adventure of going to another planet, and about his chances of returning from it. What he had not thought about was being on it. It was with a kind of stupefaction each morning that he found himself neither arriving in nor escaping from, but simply living on Malacandra, waking, sleeping, eating, swimming, and even, as the days passed, talking. The wonder of it smote him most strongly when he found himself, about 3 weeks after his arrival, actually going for a walk. A few weeks later, he had his favorite walks and his favorite foods. He was beginning to develop habits. He knew a male from a female horse at sight, and even individual differences were becoming plain. Shoy, who had first found him, miles away to the north, was a very different person from the grey-muzzled, venerable Snowhra, who was daily teaching him the language. And the young of the species were different again. They were delightful. You could forget all about the rationality of Frossa in dealing with them. Too young to trouble him with the baffling enigma of reason in an inhuman form, they solaced his loneliness, as if he had been allowed to bring a few dogs with him from the earth. The cubs, on their part, felt the liveliest interest in the hairless goblin which had appeared among them. With them, and therefore indirectly with their dams, he was a brilliant success. Of the community in general, his earlier impressions were all gradually being corrected. His first diagnosis of their culture was what he called Old Stone Age. The few cutting instruments they possessed were made of stone. They seemed to have no pottery, but a few clumsy vessels used for boiling, and boiling was the only cookery they attempted. Their common drinking vessel, dish, and ladle, all in one, was the oyster-like shell in which he had first tasted Foss hospitality. The fish which it contained was their only animal food. Vegetable fare they had in great plenty and variety, some of it delicious. Even the pinkish-white weed which covered the whole handramit was edible at a pinch, so that if he had starved before Hyoy found him, he would have starved amidst abundance. No horse, however, ate the weed, on a draskrud, for choice, though it might be used faute de mieux on a journey. Their dwellings were beehive-shaped huts of stiff leaf, and the villages, there were several in the neighborhood, were always built beside rivers for warmth and well upstream towards the walls of the handramit where the water was hottest. They slept on the ground. They seemed to have no arts, except a kind of poetry and music which was practiced almost every evening by a team or troop of 4 Hossa. One recited half-chanting at great length, while the other 3, sometimes singly and sometimes antiphonally, interrupted him from time to time with song. Ransom could not find out whether these interruptions were simply lyrical interludes or dramatic dialogue arising out of the leader's narrative. He could make nothing of the music. The voices were not disagreeable, and the scale seemed adapted to human ears, but the time pattern was meaningless to his sense of rhythm. The occupations of the tribe or family were at first mysterious. People were always disappearing for a few days and reappearing again. There was a little fishing and much journeying in boats of which he never discovered the object. Then one day he saw a kind of caravan of horses setting out by land, each with a load of vegetable food on its head. Apparently there was some kind of trade in Malacandra. He discovered their agriculture in the first week. About a mile down the handramit, one came to broad lands free of forest and clothed for many miles together in low, pulpy vegetation in which yellow, orange, and blue predominated. Later on, there were lettuce-like plants about the height of a terrestrial birch tree. Where one of these overhung the warmth of water, you could step into one of the lower leaves and lie deliciously as in a gently moving, fragrant hammock. Elsewhere it was not warm enough to sit still for long out of doors. The general temperature of the handramit was that of a fine winter's morning on Earth. These food-producing areas were worked communally by the surrounding villages, and division of labor had been carried to a higher point than he expected. Cutting, drying, storing, transport, and something like manuring were all carried on. and he suspected that some, at least, of the water channels were artificial. But the real revolution in his understanding of the Xhosa began when he had learned enough of their language to attempt some satisfaction of their curiosity about himself. In answer to their questions, he began by saying that he had come out of the sky. Snoha immediately asked from which planet or earth. Handra. Ransom, who had deliberately given a childish version of the truth in order to adapt it to the supposed ignorance of his audience, was a little annoyed to find Snoha painfully explaining to him that he could not live in the sky because there was no air in it. He might have come through the sky, but he must have come from a Handra. He was quite unable to point Earth out to them in the night sky. They seemed surprised at his inability, and repeatedly pointed out to him a bright planet low on the western horizon, a little south of where the sun had gone down. He was surprised that they selected a planet instead of a mere star, and stuck to their choice. Could it be possible that they understood astronomy? Unfortunately, he still knew too little of the language to explore their knowledge. He turned the conversation by asking them the name of the bright southern planet, and was told that it was Thokandra, the silent world or planet. "Why do you call it Thok?" he asked. "Why silent?" No one knew. "The Sereni know," said Snoha. "That is the sort of thing they know." Then he was asked how he had come, and made a very poor attempt at describing the spaceship. But again, the Sereni would know. Had he come alone? No, he had come with two others of his kind, bad men. Bent men was the nearest Xhosian equivalent, who tried to kill him, but he had run away from them. The Xhosa found this very difficult, but all finally agreed that he ought to go to Oyasa. Oyasa would protect him. Ransom asked who Oyasa was. Slowly, and with many misunderstandings, he hammered out the information that Oyasa, 1, lived at Meldelorn, 2, knew everything and ruled everyone, 3, had always been there, and 4, was not a Xhos, nor one of the Sereni. Then Ransom, following his own idea, asked if Oyasa had made the world. The Xhosa almost barked in the fervor of their denial. Did people in Thokandra not know that Melel-Dil the Young had made and still ruled the world? Even a child knew that. Where did Melel-Dil live? Ransom asked. With the Old One. And who was the Old One? Ransom did not understand the answer. He tried again. Where was the Old One? He is not that sort, said Snorra, that he has to live anywhere, and proceeded to a good deal which Ransom did not follow. But he followed enough to feel once more a certain irritation. Ever since he had discovered the rationality of the Xhosa, he had been haunted by a conscientious scruple as to whether it might not be his duty to undertake their religious instruction. Now, as a result of his tentative efforts, he found himself being treated as if he were the savage, and being given a first sketch of civilized religion, a sort of Xhosian equivalent of the shorter catechism. It became plain that Melel-Dil was a spirit without body, parts, or passions. He is not a Hnau, said the Xhosa. What is a Hnau? Asked Ransom. You are Hnau. I am Hnau. The Sereni are Hnau. The Pafifiltrigi are Hnau. Pafifiltrigi, said Ransom. More than 10 days' journey to the west, said Snorra. The story is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Out of the Silent Planet continued. More than 10 days' journey to the west, said Snorra. The Harandra sinks down, not into a Handramit, but into a broad place, an open place, spreading every way. 5 days' journey from the north to the south of it, 10 days' journey from the east to the west. The forests are of other colors there than here. They are blue and green. It is very deep there. It goes to the roots of the world. The best things that can be dug out of the earth are there. The Pafifiltrigi live there. They delight in digging. What they dig they soften with fire and make things of it. They are little people, smaller than you, long in the snout, pale, busy. They have long limbs in front. No Nahu can match them in making and shaping things as none can match us in singing. But let a man see. He turned and spoke to one of the younger Xhosa, and presently, passed from hand to hand, there came to him a little bowl. He held it close to the firelight and examined it. It was certainly of gold, and Ransom realized the meaning of Divine's interest in Malacandra. "Is there much of this thing?" he asked. Yes, he was told. It was washed down in most of the rivers, but the best and most was among the Pififiltrigi, and it was they who were skilled in it. Arbol Hrul, they called it, sun's blood. He looked at the bowl again. It was covered with fine etching. He saw pictures of Hrossa and of smaller, almost frog-like animals, and then of Sorns. He pointed to the latter inquiringly. "Sereni," said the Hrossa, confirming his suspicions. "They live up almost in the Harandra, in the big caves." The frog-like animals, or taper-headed, frog-bodied animals, were Pififiltrigi. Ransom turned it over in his mind. On Malacandra, apparently, 3 distinct species had reached rationality, and none of them had yet exterminated the other 2. It concerned him intensely to find out which was the real master. "Which of the Knahu rule?" he asked. "Oyasa rules," was the reply. "Is he Knahu?" This puzzled them a little. The Sereni, they thought, would be better at that kind of question. Perhaps Oyasa was Knahu, but a very different Knahu. He had no death and no young. "These Sereni know more than the Hrossa?" asked Ransom. This produced more a debate than an answer. What emerged finally was the Sereni or Sorns were perfectly helpless in a boat and could not fish to save their lives, could hardly swim, could make no poetry, and even when Hrossa had made it for them, could understand only the inferior sorts. But they were admittedly good at finding out things about the stars and understanding the darker utterances of Oyasa and telling what happened in Malacandra long ago, longer ago than anyone could remember. Ah, the intelligentsia, thought Ransom. They must be the real rulers, however it is disguised. He tried to ask what would happen if the Sorns used their wisdom to make the Hrossa do things. This was as far as he could get in his halting Malacandrian. The question did not sound nearly so urgent in this form as it would have done if he had been able to say, used their scientific resources for the exploitation of their uncivilized neighbors. But he might have spared his pains. The mention of the Sorns' inadequate appreciation of poetry had diverted the whole conversation into literary channels. Of the heated and apparently technical discussion which followed, he understood not a syllable. Naturally, his conversations with the Hrossa did not all turn on Malacandra. He had to repay them with information about Earth. He was hampered in this both by the humiliating discoveries which he was constantly making of his own ignorance about his native planet, and partly by his determination to conceal some of the truth. He did not want to tell them too much of our human wars and industrialisms. He remembered how H.G. Wells's Cavor had met his end on the moon. Also, he felt shy. A sensation akin to that of physical nakedness came over him whenever they questioned him too closely about men, the Mana, as they called them. Moreover, he was determined not to let them know that he had been brought here to be given to the Sorns, for he was becoming daily more certain that these were the dominant species. What he did tell them fired the imagination of the Hrossa. They all began making poems about the strange Handra, where the plants were hard like stone, and the earth weed green like rock, and the waters cold and salt, and Mana lived out on top, on the Harandra. They were even more interested in what he had to tell them of the aquatic animal with snapping jaws, which he had fled from in their own world, and even in their own Handramit. It was a Hanakra, they all agreed. They were intensely excited. There had not been a Hanakra in the valley for many years. The youth of the Hrossa got out their weapons, primitive harpoons with points of bone, and the very cubs began playing at Hanakra hunting in the shallows. Some of the mothers showed signs of anxiety and wanted the cubs to be kept out of the water, but in general the news of the Hanakra seemed to be immensely popular. Hyoy set off at once to do something to his boat, and Ransom accompanied him. He wished to make himself useful, and was already beginning to have some vague capacity with the primitive Hrossian tools. They walked together to Hyoy's Creek, a stone's throw through the forest. On the way, where the path was single and Ransom was following Hyoy, they passed a little she-horse, not much more than a cub. She spoke as they passed, but not to them. Her eyes were on a spot about 5 yards away. "Who do you speak to, Freaky?" said Ransom. "To the Eldil." "Where? Did you not see him?" "I saw nothing." "There, there," she cried suddenly. "Ah, he is gone. Did you not see him?" "I saw no one." "Hyoy," said the cub, "the man cannot see the Eldil." But Hyoy, continuing steadily on his way, was already out of earshot, and had apparently noticed nothing. Ransom concluded that Freaky was pretending, like the young of his own species. In a few moments he rejoined his companion. Chapter 12. They worked hard at Hyoy's boat till noon, and then spread themselves on the weed close to the warmth of the creek, and began their midday meal. The warlike nature of their preparations suggested many questions to Ransom. He knew no word for war, but he managed to make Hyoy understand what he wanted to know. Did Sereny and Hrossa and Pfiffeltriggy ever go out like this with weapons against each other? "What for?" asked Hyoy. It was difficult to explain. If both wanted one thing and neither would give it, said Ransom, would the other at last come with force? Would they say, "Give it or we kill you"? What sort of thing? Well, food, perhaps. If the Knahu wanted food, why should we not give it to them? We often do. But how if we had not enough for ourselves? But Maleldil will not stop the plants growing. Hyoy, if you had more and more young, would Maleldil broaden the Handramit and make enough plants for them all? The Sereny know that sort of thing. But why should we have more young? Ransom found this difficult. At last he said, "Is the begetting of young not a pleasure among the Hrossa?" "A very great one, man. This is what we call love." If a thing is a pleasure, a man wants it again. He might want the pleasure more often than the number of young that could be fed. It took Hyoy a long time to get the point. "You mean," he said slowly, "that he might do it not only in 1 or 2 years of his life, but again?" "Yes." "But why? Would he want his dinner all day, or want to sleep after he had slept? I do not understand." "But a dinner comes every day. This love, you say, comes only once while the horse lives? But it takes his whole life. When he is young, he has to look for his mate, and then he has to court her, then he begets young, then he rears them, then he remembers all this and boils it inside him and makes it into poems and wisdom. But the pleasure he must be content only to remember. That is like saying, 'My food I must be content only to eat.' I do not understand. A pleasure is full-grown only when it is remembered. You are speaking, man, as if the pleasure were one thing and the memory another. It is all one thing. The Sereny could say it better than I say it now, not better than I could say it in a poem. What you call remembering is the last part of the pleasure, as the Kra is the last part of a poem. When you and I met, the meeting was over very shortly. It was nothing. Now it is growing something as we remember it. But still we know very little about it. What it will be when I remember it as I lie down to die, what it makes in me all my days till then, that is the real meeting. The other is only the beginning of it. You say you have poets in your world. Do they not teach you this? Perhaps some of them do, said Ransom. But even in a poem, does a cross never long to hear one splendid line over again? Hyoy's reply, unfortunately, turned on one of those points in their language which Ransom had not mastered. There were 2 verbs which both, as far as he could see, meant to long or yearn. But the Hrossa drew a sharp distinction, even an opposition between them. Hyoy seemed to him merely to be saying that everyone would long for it, one alone, but no one in his senses could long for it. That's the line. And indeed, he continued, the poem is a good example. For the most splendid line becomes fully splendid only by means of all the lines after it. If you went back to it, you would find it less splendid than you thought. You would kill it. I mean in a good poem. But in a bent poem, Hyoy? A bent poem is not listened to, a man. And how of love in a bent life? How could the life of a Knahu be bent? Did you say, Hyoy, that there are no bent Hrossa? Hyoy reflected. I have heard, he said at last, of something like what you mean. It is said that sometimes here and there a cub at a certain age gets strange twists in him. I have heard of one that wanted to eat earth. There might perhaps be somewhere a cross, likewise, that wanted to have the years of love prolonged. I have not heard of it, but it might be. I have heard of something stranger. There is a poem about a cross who lived long ago in another Handramit, who saw things all made two suns in the sky, two heads on a neck. And last of all, they say that he fell into such a frenzy that he desired two mates. I do not ask you to believe it, but that is the story, that he loved to Hresni. Ransom pondered this. Here, unless Shoy was deceiving him, was a species naturally continent, naturally monogamous. And yet was it so strange? Some animals, he knew, had regular breeding seasons, and if nature could perform the miracle of turning the sexual impulse outward at all, why could she not go further and fix it, not morally but instinctively, to a single object? He even remembered dimly having heard that some terrestrial animals, some of the lower animals, were naturally monogamous. Among the Hrossa, anyway, it was obvious that unlimited breeding and promiscuity were as rare as the rarest perversions. At last it dawned upon him that it was not they, but his own species that were the puzzle. That the Hrossa should have such instincts was mildly surprising. But how came it that the instincts of the Hrossa so closely resembled the unattained ideals of that far-divided species, man, whose instincts were so deplorably different? What was the history of man? But Shoy was speaking again. Undoubtedly, he said, Maleldil made us so. How could there ever be enough to eat if everyone had 20 young? And how could we endure to live and let time pass if we were always crying for 1 day or 1 year to come back? If we did not know that every day in a life fills the whole life with expectation and memory, and that these are that day? All the same, said Ransom, unconsciously nettled on behalf of his own world, Maleldil has let in the Hanakra. Oh, but that is so different. I long to kill this Hanakra, as he also longs to kill me. I hope that my ship will be the first, and I the first in my ship with my straight spear when the black jaws snap. And if he kills me, my people will mourn, and my brothers will desire still more to kill him. But they will not wish that there were no Meraki, nor do I. How can I make you understand when you do not understand the poets? The Hanakra is our enemy, but he is also our beloved. We feel in our hearts his joy as he looks down from the mountain of water in the north where he was born. We leap with him when he jumps the falls. And when winter comes, and the lake smokes higher than our heads, it is with his eyes that we see it, and know that his roaming time has come. We hang images of him in our houses, and the sign of all the Hrossa is a Hanakra. In him the spirit of the valley lives, and our young play at being Haneraki as soon as they can splash in the shallows. And then he kills them? Not often, then. The Hrossa would be bet Hrossa if they let him get so near. Long before he had come down so far, we should have sought him out. No, man, it is not a few deaths roving the world around him that make Ethnahu miserable. It is a bent Ethnahu that would blacken the world. And I say also this. I do not think the forest would be so bright, nor the water so warm, nor love so sweet, if there were no danger in the lakes. I will tell you a day in my life that has shaped me. Such a day as comes only once, like love, or serving Oyasa in Meldalorn. Then I was young, not much more than a cub, when I went far, far up the Handramit to the land where stars shine at midday, and even water is cold. A great waterfall I climbed. I stood on the shore of Balki, the pool, which is the place of most awe in all worlds. The walls of it go up for ever, and huge and holy images are cut in them, the work of old times. There is the fall called the Mountain of Water. Because I have stood there alone, Maleldil and I, for even Oyarsa sent me no word, my heart has been higher, my song deeper, all my days. But do you think it would have been so unless I had known that in Balki, Haneraki dwelled? There I drank life, because death was in the pool. That was the best of drinks, save one. What one? Asked Ransom. Death itself, in the day I drink it and go to Maleldil. Shortly after that they rose and resumed their work. The sun was declining as they came back through the wood. It occurred to Ransom to ask Huey a question. "Huey," he said, "it comes into my head that when I first saw you, and before you saw me, you were already speaking. That was how I knew that you were Xnau, for otherwise I should have thought you a beast and run away. But who are you speaking to?" "To an Eldil." "What is that? I saw no one." "Are there no Eldilla in your world, man?" "That must be strange." "But what are they?" "They come from Oyasa. They are, I suppose, a kind of Xnahu." "As we came out today, I passed a child who said she was talking to an Eldil, but I could see nothing." "One can see by looking at your eyes, man, that they are different from ours. But Eldilla are hard to see. They are not like us. Light goes through them. You must be looking in the right place and the right time. And that is not likely to come about unless the Eldil wishes to be seen. Sometimes you can mistake them for a sunbeam, or even a moving of the leaves. But when you look again, you see that it was an Eldil, and that it is gone. But whether your eyes can ever see them, I do not know. The Sereni would know that." Chapter 13. The whole village was astir next morning before the sunlight, already visible on the Harandra, had penetrated the forest. By the light of the cooking fires, Ransom saw an incessant activity of Frossa. The females were pouring out steaming food from clumsy pots. Snoha was directing the transportation of piles of spears to the boats. Joy, in the midst of a group of the most experienced hunters, was talking too rapidly and too technically for Ransom to follow. Parties were arriving from the neighboring villages, and the cubs, squealing with excitement, were running hither and thither among their elders. He found that his own share in the hunt had been taken for granted. He was to be in Hyoi's boat with Hyoi and Twin. The two Hrossa would take it in turns to paddle, while Ransom and the disengaged Hross would be in the bows. He understood the Hrossa well enough now to know that they were making him the noblest offer in their power, and that Hyoi and Twin were each tormented by the fear lest he should be paddling when the Hanakra appeared. A short time ago, in England, nothing would have seemed more impossible to Ransom than to accept the post of honor and danger in an attack upon an unknown but certainly deadly aquatic monster. Even more recently, when he had first fled from the Sorns, or when he had lain pitying himself in the forest by night, it would hardly have been in his power to do what he was intending to do today. For his intention was clear. Whatever happened, he must show that the human species also were Xnau. He was only too well aware that such resolutions might look very different when the moment came, but he felt an unwanted assurance that somehow or other he would be able to go through with it. It was necessary, and the necessary was always possible. Perhaps, too, there was something in the air he now breathed, or in the society of the Hrossa, which had begun to work a change in him. The lake was just giving back the first rays of the sun, and he found himself kneeling side by side with Wynne, as he had been told to, in the bows of Hyoi's ship, with a little pile of throwing spears between his knees and one in his right hand, stiffening his body against the motion as Hyoi paddled them out into their place. At least 100 boats were taking part in the hunt. They were in 3 parties. The central, and far the smallest, was to work its way up the current by which Hyoi and Ransom had descended after their first meeting. Longer ships than he had yet seen, 8 paddled ships, were used for this. The habit of the Snakra was to float down the current whenever he could. Meeting the ships, he would presumably dart out of it into the still water to left or right. Hence, while the central party slowly beat up the current, the light ships, paddling far faster, would cruise at will up and down either side of it to receive the quarry as soon as he broke what might be called his cover. In this game, numbers and intelligence were on the side of the Hrossa. The Hanakra had speed on his side and also invisibility, for he could swim underwater. He was nearly invulnerable, except through his open mouth. If the 2 hunters in the bows of the boat he made for muffed their shots, this was usually the last of them and of their boat. In the light skirmishing parties there were 2 things a brave hunter could aim at. He could keep well back and close to the long ships where the Hanakra was most likely to break out, or he could get as far forward as possible in the hope of meeting the Hanakra going at its full speed and yet untroubled by the hunt, and of inducing it, by a well-aimed spear, to leave the current then and there. One could thus anticipate the beaters and kill the beast, if that was how the matter ended, on one's own. This was the desire of Hyoy and Wynne, and almost, so strongly they infected him, of ransom. Hence, hardly had the heavy craft of the beaters begun their slow progress up current amid a wall of foam, when he found his own ship speeding northward as fast as Hyoy could drive her, already passing boat after boat and making for the freest water. The speed was exhilarating. In the cold morning, the warmth of the blue expanse they were clearing was not unpleasant. Behind them arose, re-echoed from the remote rock pinnacles on either side of the valley, the bell-like, deep-mouthed voices of more than 200 horsa, more musical than a cry of hounds, but closely akin to it in quality as in purport. Something long sleeping in the blood awoke in Ransom. It did not seem impossible at this moment that even he might be the Hanakra slayer, that the fame of man Nakrapunt might be handed down to posterity in this world that knew no other man. But he had had such dreams before, and knew how they ended. Imposing humility on the newly risen riot of his feelings, he turned his eyes to the troubled water of the current which they were skirting without entering, and watching intently. For a long time nothing happened. He became conscious of the stiffness of his attitude, and deliberately relaxed his muscles. Presently Wynne reluctantly went aft to paddle, and Hyoy came forward to take his place. Almost as soon as the change had been effected, Hyoy spoke softly to him, and said, without taking his eyes off the current, "There is an Eldil coming to us over the water." Ransom could see nothing, or nothing that he could distinguish from imagination, of the dance of sunlight on the lake. A moment later Hyoy spoke again, but not to him. "What is it, Skyborn?" What happened next was the most uncanny experience Ransom had yet had on Malacandra. He heard the voice. It seemed to come out of the air, about a yard above his head, and it was almost an octave higher than the Hross's, higher even than his own. He realized that a very little difference in his ear would have made the Eldil as inaudible to him as it was invisible. "It is the man with you, Hyoy," said the voice. "He ought not to be there. He ought to be going to Oyarsa. Bent Hnau of his own kind from Thokandra are following him. He should go to Oyarsa. If they find him anywhere else, there will be evil." "He hears you, Skyborn," said Hyoy. "And have you no message for my wife? You know what she wishes to be told." "I have a message for Flaherty," said the Eldil, "but you will not be able to take it. I will go to her now myself. All that is well. Only let the man go to Oyarsa." There was a moment's silence. "He is gone," said Wynne, "and we have lost our share in the hunt." "Yes," said Hyoy with a sigh. "We must put man ashore and teach him the way to Meldilorn." Ransom was not so sure of his courage, but that one part of him felt an instant relief at the idea of any diversion from their present business. But the other part of him urged him to hold on to his newfound manhood. Now or never, with such companions or with none, he must leave a deed on his memory instead of one more broken dream. It was in obedience to something like conscience that he exclaimed, "No, no, there is time for that after the hunt. We must kill the Hanakra first." "Once an Eldil has spoken," began Hyoy, when suddenly Wynne gave a great cry, a bark, Ransom would have called it 3 weeks ago, and pointed. There, not a furlong away, was the torpedo-like track of foam, and now, visible through the wall of the foam, they caught the metallic glint of the monster's sides. Wynne was paddling furiously. Hyoy threw and missed. As his first spear smote the water, his second was already in the air. This time it must have touched the Hanakra. He wheeled right out of the current. Ransom saw the great black pit of his mouth open twice, and twice shut with its snap of shark-like teeth. He himself had thrown now, hurriedly, excitedly, with unpracticed hand. "Back!" shouted Hyoy to Wynne, who was already backing water with every pound of his vast strength. Then all became confused. He heard Wynne shout, "Shore!" There came a shock that flung him forward almost into the Hanakra's jaws, and he found himself at the same moment up to his waist in water. It was at him the teeth were snapping. Then as he flung shaft after shaft into the great cavern of the gaping brute, he saw Hyoy perched incredibly on its back, on its nose, bending forward and hurling from there. Almost at once the horse was dislodged and fell with a wide splash nearly 10 yards away. But the Hanakra was killed. It was wallowing on its side, bubbling out its black life. The water around him was dark and stank. When he recollected himself, they were all on shore, wet, steaming, trembling with exertion, and embracing one another. This story is continued on cassette number 4, side 1.
Out of the Silent Planet by C.S. Lewis, continuing on cassette number 4, side 1. When he recollected himself, they were all on shore, wet, steaming, trembling with exertion, and embracing one another. It did not now seem strange to him to be clasped to a beast of wet fur. The breath of the Hrossa, which, though sweet, was not human breath, did not offend him. He was one with them. That difficulty which they, accustomed to more than one rational species, had perhaps never felt, was now overcome. They were all Nahu. They had stood shoulder to shoulder in the face of an enemy, and the shapes of their heads no longer mattered. And he, even Ransom, had come through it and not been disgraced. He had grown up. They were on a little promontory free of forest, on which they had run aground in the confusion of the fight. The wreckage of the boat and the corpse of the monster lay confused together in the water beside them. No sound from the rest of the hunting party was audible. They had been almost a mile ahead when they met the Hanakra. All three sat down to recover their breath. "So," said Koi, "we are Hanakra Punti. This is what I have wanted all my life." At that moment Ransom was deafened by a loud sound, a perfectly familiar sound which was the last thing he expected to hear. It was a terrestrial, human, and civilized sound. It was even European. It was the crack of an English rifle, and Hyoy, at his feet, was struggling to rise and gasping. There was blood on the white weed where he struggled. Ransom dropped on his knees beside him. The huge body of the Hross was too heavy for him to turn round. Wynne helped him. "Hyoy, can you hear me?" said Ransom, with his face close to the round, seal-like head. "Hyoy, it is through me that this has happened. It is the other Hamana who have hit you, the bent two that brought me to Malacandra. They can throw death at a distance with the thing they have made. I should have told you. We are all a bent race. We have come here to bring evil on Malacandra. We are only half Hanahu. Hyoy." His speech died away into the inarticulate. He did not know the words for forgive, or shame, or fault, hardly the word for sorry. He could only stare into Hyoy's distorted face in speechless guilt. But the frost seemed to understand. It was trying to say something, and Ransom laid his ear close to the working mouth. Hyoy's dulling eyes were fixed on his own, but the expression of a frost was not even now perfectly intelligible to him. "Na, it muttered, and then, at last, "Man, Nakrapunt." Then there came a contortion of the whole body, a gush of blood and saliva from the mouth. His arms gave way under the sudden dead weight of the sagging head, and Hyoy's face became as alien and animal as it had seemed at their first meeting. The glazed eyes and the slowly stiffening, bedraggled fur were like those of any dead beast found in an earthly wood. Ransom resisted an infantile impulse to break out into imprecations on Weston and Devine. Instead, he raised his eyes to meet those of Wynne, who was crouching, Fossa do not kneel, on the other side of the corpse. "I am in the hands of your people, Wynne," he said. "They must do as they will, but if they are wise, they will kill me, and certainly they will kill the other two." "One does not kill a Nahu," said Wynne. "Only Oyasa does that. But these other, where are they?" Ransom glanced around. It was open on the promontory, but thick wood came down to where it joined the mainland, perhaps 200 yards away. "Somewhere in the wood," he said. "Lie down, Wynne, here where the ground is lowest. They may throw from their thing again." He had some difficulty in making Wynne do as he suggested. When both were lying on dead ground, their feet almost in the water, the frost spoke again. Why did they kill him? He asked. They would not know he was Nahu, said Ransom. I have told you that there is only one kind of Nahu in our world. They would think he was a beast. If they thought that, they would kill him for pleasure, or in fear, or, he hesitated, because they were hungry. But I must tell you the truth, Win. They would kill even a Hanahu, knowing it to be Hanahu, if they thought its death would serve them. There was a short silence. I am wondering, said Ransom, if they saw me. It is for me they are looking. Perhaps if I went to them they would be content and come no farther into your land. But why do they not come out of the wood to see what they have killed? Our people are coming, said Wynne, turning his head. Ransom looked back and saw the lake black with boats. The main body of the hunt would be with them in a few minutes. They are afraid of the Hrosser, said Ransom. That is why they do not come out of the wood. I will go to them, Wynne. No, said Wynne. I have been thinking. All this has come from not obeying the Eldil. He said you were to go to Oyarsa. You ought to have been already on the road. You must go now. But that will leave the bent Hamana here. They may do more harm. They will not set on the Hrosser. You have said they are afraid. It is more likely that we will come upon them. Never fear. They will not see us or hear us. We will take them to Oyarsa. But you must go now, as the Eldil said. Your people will think I have run away because I am afraid to look in their faces after Hyoi's death. It is not a question of thinking, but of what an Eldil says. This is cub's talk. Now listen, and I will teach you the way. The Hross explained to him that 5 days' journey to the south, the Handramit joined another Handramit, and 3 days up this other Handramit to west and north was Meldilorn and the seat of Oyarsa. But there was a shorter way, a mountain road, across the corner of the Harandra between the two canyons, which would bring him down to Meldilorn on the second day. He must go into the wood before them, and through it till he came to the mountain wall of the Handramit. And he must work south along the roots of the mountains till he came to a road cut up between them. Up this he must go, and somewhere beyond the tops of the mountains he would come to the tower of Ogre. Ogre would help him. He could cut weed for his food before he left the forest and came into the rock country. Wynne realized that Ransom might meet the other two Hamana as soon as he entered the wood. If they catch you, he said, then it will be as you say. They will come no farther into our land. But it is better to be taken on your way to Oyarsa than to stay here. And once you are on the way to him, I do not think he will let the bent ones stop you. Ransom was by no means convinced that this was the best plan either for himself or for the Hrosser. But the stupor of humiliation in which he had lain ever since Hyoi fell forbade him to criticize. He was anxious only to do whatever they wanted him to do, to trouble them as little as was now possible, and above all, to get away. It was impossible to find out how Wynne felt, and Ransom sternly repressed an insistent, whining impulse to renewed protestations and regrets, self-accusations that might elicit some word of pardon. Hyoi, with his last breath, had called him Hanakra Slayer. That was forgiveness generous enough, and with that he must be content. As soon as he had mastered the details of his route, he bade farewell to Wynne and advanced alone towards the forest.